A radio message from Taiwan warned approaching Chinese warplanes to turn around. "You've entered our air defence identification zone," an Air Force official said. "Leave immediately." Such incursions are an increasingly familiar routine. But the size of the Chinese show of strength in late January 2021 was unusually large.
网络三维，那解放军在台海地区组织实战化的演练，就是坚决维护。
Beijing said the drills were designed to send a warning to anyone seeking independence for Taiwan, which is regarded by China as a breakaway province. Though the island's democratically elected government has a close security relationship with the United States.
That is potentially a very dangerous flashpoint. And it's a more dangerous flashpoint today than it was 2 or 3 years ago.
The aerial action around Taiwan also coincided with the deployment of a powerful US aircraft carrier group into the South China Sea. The use of military power, such as the deployment of warplanes or ships, close to or even inside the airspace or territorial waters of an opponent, is one of the most openly aggressive tools states can use against each other in the grey zone. It raises the risk of a miscalculation or accident that could ignite a real war. The status of Taiwan is one of an array of frictions between China's ruling Communist Party and the United States. Think the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, China's Uyghur Muslim minority in Xinjiang province, or suspicion around the origin of the coronavirus pandemic. It's creating a global battle of values, democracy against authoritarianism, and it's being fought with an array of covert weapons, from cyber attacks and information operations to economic coercion, even something called lawfare. Allegations of such behaviour are made and denied by both sides, which of course is to be expected in the grey zone. My name is Deborah Haynes. I'm the Foreign Affairs Editor at Sky News, and you're listening to my podcast, Into the Grey Zone, which explores a murky evolution of warfare. I'll explain the covert tactics used by states, criminals and terrorist groups to deceive, gain influence, and at times, kill. In this episode, we look at how tensions between an increasingly confident China and its democratic rivals are playing out in the grey zone. In particular, we explore Beijing's crackdown on pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong and ask what that might mean for the future of another key territory, the democratically governed island of Taiwan.
Every now and again, an email address that looks remarkably like mine or is clearly impersonating me sends out press releases or information to various people claiming to be from me and claiming that I have agreed something or done something or whatever it happens to be.
Tom Tuggenhart is a Conservative MP and chair of the UK Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. He's describing what he alleges are attempts originating from China to discredit him by sending out messages from phony email accounts purporting to be his.
I've spoken to the internet providers who host these mail sites, and each time they've told me pretty clearly where the email address was registered, and as they take it down, point out that this is quite clearly a set up by people within mainland China, and it's pretty pathetic. It's not the most sophisticated of hacks, but it's another attempt to intimidate. And while I don't feel even slightly threatened by them, if I were a Hong Konger or somebody from mainland China who still had family in mainland China or anywhere that China could influence, I may well feel very differently about it.
I asked the Chinese embassy in the UK about the allegation. They responded by questioning whether Mr. Tuggenhart had, quote, verified the authenticity of his claim. Mr. Tuggenhart has perhaps drawn this alleged grey zone style fire because of his vocal criticism of the Chinese government under its president, Xi Jinping.
When I took over the chairmanship of the Foreign Affairs Committee in 2017, one of the first things I was going to do was look at the relationship with China. And I thought I was going to look at it very much in the way of the times, which is, yeah, there's problems, but broadly speaking, let's see how we cooperate better.
He's referring to a period which in theory is still current, dubbed the Golden Era, between the UK and China, framed by a push for increased trade and investment and perhaps less emphasis on security concerns. It began when David Cameron was Prime Minister and included a very high-profile state visit to the UK in 2015 by President Xi.
It became very clear to me very quickly that this wasn't going to work because the way that China was behaving even towards us was hostile and bullying and really meant that we had to think again about the way that even the committee engaged. Now, we started to warn very early, therefore, that China was not playing by the same rules as others anymore, and that this relationship was really difficult.
A similar rethink was also underway in the United States. The US strategy on China for at least the past 3 to 4 decades had been that supporting Chinese economic development and growth would drive political liberalisation. But the China of today looks less and less economically or politically liberal.
What we've seen unfold is sort of that shift in paradigm from one of helping the Chinese economy develop, because if they develop, they'll liberalize, to they're not doing that. And so therefore, what is the new approach we should take?
Matt Turpin is a visiting fellow specialising in US policy on the People's Republic of China, or PRC, at the Hoover Institution, a US think tank. He previously served as Director for China on the US National Security Council from 2018 to 2019, following 20 years in the armed forces.
And that new approach is an approach of competition with a desire to avoid conflict. Understanding that conflict is in neither's interest, and that you could achieve your outcomes through a strategic competition as opposed to a conflict.
For its part, the Chinese government has denied allegations of hostile behaviour against other states. By contrast, it's accused the US, the UK and others of being the hostile actors, saying Beijing seeks dialogue, not division. This is President Xi speaking virtually in January 2021 at the annual World Economic Forum.
女士们、先生们、朋友们，世界上的问题错综复杂。
He warned against what some see as a new Cold War, with China replacing the then Soviet Union as arch-enemy of the West.
We should reject the outdated Cold War and zero-sum game mentality, adhere to mutual respect and accommodation, and enhance political trust through strategic communication.
But critics of the Chinese Communist Party say such public sentiments mask Beijing's true agenda, that of an ideological struggle with the West, in which China emerges dominant.
I'm afraid that the world is going, I hope not towards decoupling, but I think diverging is inevitable, partly because our political systems are very different, and any thought of political reform in China, I think, is well off the menu for the immediate future.
Charlie Parton is a former British diplomat who spent much of his career working on China.
Our economic systems are increasingly difficult as China pushes very much a state model. And our value systems are increasingly different. I mean, just look what's happening in Xinjiang or Hong Kong.
He's referring first to allegations by human rights groups of abuses described by the United States as genocide against Uyghur Muslims and other minorities in the northwestern province of Xinjiang. This includes the alleged detention in the past few years of more than 1 million people in a network of camps, as well as reports of forced labour and of women being forcibly sterilised. Beijing denies allegations of abuse, It describes the camps as re-education centres that offer vocational training to help counter Islamist extremism and separatism. With Hong Kong, the UK and China are at odds over a new security law that London sees as a way to curb dissent in its former colony, and Beijing sees as vital to maintaining security. Against this fractious backdrop, a growing number of politicians in the UK, the United States, and other Western democracies have accused China of using grey zone tactics to undermine their respective countries and to bolster Beijing. This includes with alleged disinformation operations, such as official spokespeople making unsubstantiated claims about how the coronavirus pandemic may have started in the United States. The Chinese embassy in London said this isn't true. In an emailed statement, it said,
"China is not using disinformation. China is a victim of disinformation and is opposed to disinformation."
In February 2021, Beijing even banned BBC World from broadcasting in the country, alleging that its reports on China breached guidelines on truthfulness and fairness. But the move came barely a week after Ofcom, the British media watchdog, decided to ban the Chinese state TV company CGTN from broadcasting in the UK, after establishing that it was ultimately controlled by the Chinese Communist Party rather than editorially independent.
CGTN is, a self-avowed arm of the state and the party. I mean, it is a media outlet whose job it is to work for this PRC.
Matt Turpin again.
Its employees are employees of the state, and as Xi Jinping has made kind of quite clear, he sees PRC media as the voice of the party, right? And that their primary job is to tell the party's story well. And that is what their primary job is. And that's very different than a concept of sort of an independent media that allows itself to make its own decisions and its own editorial decisions about what it reports on and what it does.
A very live example, then, of a clash of values. Another concern among Western democracies is about allowing Chinese firms to be involved in elements of their critical national infrastructure, such as communications, energy, or water supplies. You might remember a dramatic diplomatic flip-flop in the UK in 2019 and 2020 over whether or not the government would allow the Chinese technology company Huawei to be involved in its next-generation 5G mobile networks. The United States put huge pressure on London to say no, insisting there could be a spying risk, such as if the Chinese government used Huawei to plant malware on the UK's systems. Such claims have been strongly rejected by the Chinese government and Huawei. The embassy told me, again in its statement, read by producer Chris,
China opposes erroneous acts of abusing state power and overstretching the concept of national security to suppress foreign companies. It is hoped that other countries will provide a fair, just and non-discriminatory environment for Chinese businesses.
Huawei deals with the question of whether it's ever worked with Chinese intelligence in a question and answer section on its website, saying, no, Huawei does not work with Chinese intelligence and never has. Doing so would run contrary to our commitment to our customers, and Huawei would never betray that trust. One other area that's important to mention is a flagship policy of President Xi's called the Belton Road Initiative. It's a hugely ambitious, multi-billion-dollar programme to build better sea and land links between Asia, Africa and Europe. Dozens of countries have signed up to Chinese infrastructure projects, such as ports and railways, but critics in the West view the initiative as a way for China to expand its reach. There have also been allegations of what's called debt trap diplomacy, where Beijing allegedly ensnares countries by lending them money to build infrastructure, and then gains power over them when they have trouble making repayments. Dr. Shi Yin Hong is director of the Academic Committee of the School of International Studies and US Research Center of Renmin University in Beijing. I asked him what he thinks.
Well, this kind of attack and the criticism of China has already operated by Western governments and Western media for years. And I think that the real situation is much more complicated. And because China, of course, is portion, Belt and Road. But on one hand, and this is a learning process.
But is China trying to grow its influence around the world? Like, does China want more people to follow?
And there are a lot of exaggerations, especially about the China's intention and practice of expanding strategic and military influence along the Belt and Road. And there are a lot of exaggeration. I think for most of the, I guess that for most of cases, China's motivation mainly is economic extension and diplomatic extension.
What's different about China, compared with other states like Russia and Iran, that the West also accuses of hostile grey zone activities, is that Beijing is in a position of strength as the world's second largest economy and a growing military power. A worsening of ties between China and the West would have a significant impact on both sides. Ken McCallum is the Director General of MI5, the UK's security service. He used this striking phrase to describe the challenge in comments he made to the media in October 2020.
If the question is, which country's intelligence services caused the most aggravation to the UK in October 2020, the answer is Russia. If, on the other hand, the question is, which state will be shaping our world across the next decade, presenting big opportunities and big challenges for the UK, the answer is China. You might think in terms of the Russian intelligence services providing bursts of bad weather, while China is changing the climate.
A place where a shift is already being felt is in Hong Kong. Pro-democracy campaigners and some British politicians accuse Beijing of using a range of grey zone-style tactics, including the weaponisation of legislation, to erode the rights and freedoms of residents in this former British colony. China denies the allegation, accusing the UK of meddling in its internal affairs. I was in Hong Kong in 1997 for the handover, and I can just remember that people were so worried back then about what would happen once the handover happened.
For a lot of Hong Kong people, it was such an worried and anxious period for them.
I'm talking via Zoom to Nathan Law, a pro-democracy activist from Hong Kong, about the 1st of July 1997, when control of this vibrant financial hub returned to China, ending 156 years of British rule. I was a student at the time, about to head off to Japan to study for a year, but I spent some of that summer in Hong Kong and had the chance to witness this historic event.
They were stepping into the Chinese communist regime's ruling without any concrete protection for their rights. Even though the Chinese Communist Party promised Hong Kong people that they will enjoy their way of life, the so-called socialist lifestyle will not replace the capitalist way of life in Hong Kong. The freedom will be protected by the basic law, which is our constitution. But these are empty words for Hong Kong people.
Nathan, who's 27, is speaking from what he sees as bitter experience. In January 2020, he was hoping to run for political office in Hong Kong. Instead, 12 months later, he's seeking political asylum in the UK after fleeing his city following the imposition of a new security law by Beijing, which critics say is aimed at silencing dissent. China says it's purely about improving security. The law can be a powerful tool of influence and intimidation in the grey zone. Experts use the term lawfare to describe what's effectively the weaponization of legislation to force an opponent to act or not to act a certain way.
It's how you use the law as a weapon to achieve an operational objective, but also a non-military objective, and how you can use it as well to bolster a state's legitimacy or to weaken the adversary activities or legitimacy.
Julie Mariano, a French former Air Force officer, is doing a PhD on the subject. She's also a research fellow at the UK think tank Policy Exchange.
And I think that is key, the understanding of this phenomenon today, which is actually linking every single element of the grey zone.
So how important do you think lawfare is in the grey zone? Like how important a tool?
Huge, yeah, everywhere. Like you say, grey zone, it's the ambiguity. So you play on existing legal gaps, legal discrepancies, and legal interpretation. And the Chinese are very, very good at it. They've done it since the beginning. Actually, the term lawfare, the shortened hand lawfare, law plus warfare, was not created by the Chinese. It was created, I think, in 1975. But it was, for the first time, used as such and developed as a strategy by the Chinese in a book called Unrestricted Warfare. So, they're very familiar with that. That gives you an idea of their mindset.
She's talking about a book that came out in 1999 on military strategy by two colonels in China's People's Liberation Army, or PLA. As the title might suggest, it explores how warfare isn't restricted to a conventional military battlefield, but can be fought in many other ways, such as through trade or legal tools. Julie claims an example of China using lawfare is the passing of the new national security legislation for Hong Kong in 2020, despite warnings from the UK that it violated an agreement between the two countries to guarantee the rights and freedoms of Hong Kong residents for 50 years following the handover. Nathan agrees.
Well, it's so clear that after the implementation of the national security law, there is a sense of terror and politics of fear in Hong Kong. For example, there are people being arrested just because they have chanted certain slogan. They have displayed certain flags that resemble the movement. And it's definitely like setting up examples and threatening people from expressing their political point of view. So we could see that the way people acting in their own life has been changed, and it really strained the whole civic society.
But Beijing insists the legislation was urgently needed to protect Hong Kong from the threats of secession, subversion, and foreign interference. The Chinese embassy again, in its statement, voiced by producer Chris.
Hong Kong residents have enjoyed unprecedented rights and freedom. What the British side should do is to discard its colonial mentality, stop applying double standards, and respect the basic principle of non-interference in other countries' internal affairs in international relations.
Nathan says what he describes as his political awakening happened when he was in his late teens. While at university in 2014, he and a friend, Joshua Wong, a fellow high-profile activist, emerged as leading figures in what became known as the Umbrella Movement.
Under the skyscrapers, songs, passion, and extraordinary numbers have brought Asia's financial hub to a halt. Their chants call for the Chinese appointed leader here to resign. But there's no anger, no violence. It feels like every student in Hong Kong is side by side, each fighting for the right to vote.
They held weeks of protests using umbrellas as a symbol of peaceful dissent against what they saw as increasing control over Hong Kong from mainland China. Nathan helped to found a new political party that sought the right to self-determination, something that's vehemently opposed by Beijing. He stood in elections in 2016 and won a seat in Hong Kong's Legislative Council, though he ended up being disqualified after a court ruled that he and 3 other pro-democracy lawmakers had failed to take their oath of office, which is ultimately an oath to China, sincerely. The following year, Nathan was arrested and jailed for his protest activities.
Can you just talk what it was like when you were in jail? What was that experience like?
I spent 2 months and around 2 months and a half there. It wasn't a long jail time, but I could definitely taste a feeling of being like the deprivation of freedom, and the way that they want to neutralize your political edge by putting you in jail and separating you from your friends and families. So I think for me, I'm lucky enough that they did not put any torture or physical abuse on me when I was in jail. But for me, it was a learning lesson that I have to navigate a pathway of being calm and peaceful, even though I have to face such atrocity from the government.
He then left Hong Kong to study for a master's at Yale University in the United States. It was around this time that he found himself the focus of what he alleges was a major disinformation campaign.
The Chinese government launched a huge smearing campaign on me, accusing me of colluding with CIA, colluding with the US government to subvert Hong Kong, to subvert China, and posting me on Weibo, on all the major social media accounts, fabricating my personal story and accusing me of a traitor and things like that, and possibly encouraging people to harass me.
Weibo is the Chinese equivalent of the social media site Twitter.
So I actually received quite a lot of death threats online.
Wow.
And I actually report to local authority when I was at Yale. And the police force investigated, and luckily none of them turned in reality.
And can you just describe how it felt to be on the receiving end of that kind of smear?
Well, I was, of course, overwhelming. We were talking about, I was like the 4th, 5th, 6th most discussed topic in the whole internet world in that period of time in China. That was a massive amount of traffic. So that was quite an incredible smearing campaign, because I was put into an example of them in their narrative as some hostile foreign forces are subverting Hong Kong and China by introducing young agents. I indeed have to fight back, because that's not true.
What's the truth?
Well, the truth is, as most of the other Hong Kong people, we fight for democracy because we love our homeland. And I've not received any sort of fundings, not trained by a CIA, not trained by SEAL, doesn't have any military background.
Nathan described other, much harder to prove grey zone methods he alleges China uses to exert control over Hong Kong and more widely. This includes something called elite capture, the alleged targeting of senior individuals in areas like business, politics, and academia, so that they wittingly or unwittingly are encouraged to support the Chinese government and its agenda. Nathan accuses the United Front Work Department, known as the United Front for short, of involvement in grey zone activities. It's an organ of the Chinese state, charged with winning hearts and minds at home and abroad, but is viewed by critics as a shadowy tool of influence.
Basically, the United Front strategy is that you isolate the main enemy, and then those that are lesser enemies, or you try and move other people from that status of enmity to neutrality, and from neutrality to on your side.
Charlie Parton has written a lot on the topic. He claims this strategy works domestically as well as overseas, where he says the US is seen as the main enemy, and the aim is to influence other countries, including the UK, to be either neutral or more in line with China.
And in order to do that, it operates in the first place through Chinese citizens abroad, its own citizens abroad, or Chinese of ethnic background. It tries to go through them, which puts a lot of pressure on them, which again is unfair. It attempts to ensure that our politicians adopt policies that are in line with Chinese interests. It attempts to ensure that our think tanks and our academics don't discuss subjects which are the ones which the Chinese government doesn't want us to talk about, like Tibet, like Hong Kong, like Xinjiang, etc. It attempts to ensure that our businesses put pressure on the government and operate in Chinese interests. The whole gamut of ensuring that the world is aligned with Chinese interests. And there's a sort of division, I think, between influence and interference. I mean, influence is another expression for that might be public diplomacy. I think that's what everybody does. What is not acceptable is interference, and that tends to be covert, coercive, or corrupting.
All of these allegations are strongly rejected by the Chinese embassy in London.
China attaches great importance to promoting normal business, political and academic interactions with the world, and welcomes the role of overseas Chinese nationals, including students, as a bridge linking China with the rest of the world, promoting relations and enhancing mutual understanding and friendship. China's conduct is above board and beyond reproach. China never interferes in the internal affairs of other countries or exports its own ideology or social system. China does not threaten anyone, but like all countries in the world, China always acts resolutely to safeguard its lawful rights, which is perfectly understandable and should be respected.
I raised the issue with China's then ambassador to the UK, Liu Xiaoming, during a press conference he gave in July 2020. You said that that China does not interfere with UK affairs, and yet some people would disagree with that and say that China is actually conducting sort of subversive activities, trying to influence elements of UK politicians and academia and even business to further its influence and interests. How do you respond to that?
I would totally reject any accusation interference in UK's internal affairs. I've been ambassador here for more than 10 years. I never come across any incident that would be excused by UK government, by any institutions with a hard evidence of China's interference into UK's internal affairs. If you have evidence, please show me, but do not make disinformation, false accusation against China.
Nathan returned to Hong Kong at the start of 2020 with plans to run again in elections for the Legislative Council. Instead, he ran into legal peril.
With the implementation of the national security law at the end of June, I felt an immense need to preserve my voice and to speak free from the threat of the law, so I decided to flee.
He's carrying on his pro-democracy campaign from the UK, but has decided to cut all ties with his family and friends in Hong Kong because he doesn't want them to risk breaking the new security law simply by being in touch with him.
Of course, you always feel unsafe. We're talking about the largest authoritarian regime in the world and the most sophisticated surveillance autocracies that we have. And they have so many tools to persecute or hunt down to people that they don't like. And on the other hand, there are enormous pressure for me that I wanted to do more and more for my fellows in Hong Kong, because they are really facing an imminent threat and dangers. People already in jail, and there are plenty of them waiting to be sentenced and possibly going to jail also. So that is a huge amount of pressure that I am expecting from myself, and it's not fun at all being out of the place that you love. So I guess there are many things that we carry, even though we leave Hong Kong, and I really do hope that every bit of actions that I'm taking now can help and can pave the way for me for my way back to Hong Kong.
Asked about Nathan's case, the Chinese embassy in London said Hong Kong acts under the rule of law. But the crackdown on pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong is seen by many China watchers as a sign of Beijing's growing confidence on the world stage, and it's fueled speculation about the fate of another problem territory, the democratically governed island of Taiwan. Freddie Lim is lead vocalist in a Taiwanese heavy metal band called Chthonic. He's also a politician who supports independence for his island of 23 million people.
I think most of the people knows that China sent their warships and fighter jets to harass Taiwan. I think this kind of harassment that China done to Taiwan has been like for 20 or 30 years. So it's kind of, Taiwanese kind of, in one hand, we get used to that. In the other hand, we are always be very cautious about that. But something that I think the world realized, or even Taiwanese realized in recent years, is that China also infiltrate Taiwan with other measures, like they spread the disinformation, they put their hands in our local communities.
He made similar allegations of interference in Taiwan by the Chinese government and its supporters, as Nathan did about Hong Kong. But while Hong Kong is internationally recognised as being part of China, Taiwan's status is much greyer. Beijing officially claims the territory as its own and ensures it remains diplomatically isolated from other countries. But Taiwan's democratically elected president, Tsai Ing-wen, says the island is an independent country. It's been an unresolved dispute since 1949. Unification by force remains a possibility, though that could draw in the United States. It's why Taiwan is one of the most sensitive issues in US-China relations.
That is potentially a very dangerous flashpoint. And it's a more dangerous flashpoint today than it was 2 or 3 years ago.
Alexander Downer was Australia's foreign minister between 1996 and 2007.
Going back to before Xi Jinping's time, I would have said, well, they still aspire to reunite the mainland and Taiwan, and I had hoped that that would happen through peaceful means, through a process of negotiation and through the evolution of time, the convergence of the political systems in Taiwan and in Beijing. But actually, in the last few years, you've seen the exact reverse happen. They have started to diverge, and there are two aspects to that. One is that Beijing has taken up a much more hostile stance towards Taiwan. But secondly, it does go to Hong Kong. I mean, they used to argue in Beijing, even including to me, that, look, what we've done with Hong Kong, with the one country, two systems formula, it's worked well there. Life just continues to continue in Hong Kong as it always did. It's not perfectly democratic according to your standards, but then it wasn't when the British ruled Hong Kong, which is true. So Taiwan can learn from the Hong Kong experience of the success of one country, two systems. But of course, now Taiwan can learn from the experience of Hong Kong, which is that Beijing introduces a national security law and exercises control over security, over the lives of people in Hong Kong. And they would do the same in Taiwan.
And do you think it could become like a military conflict?
Could, yeah. I mean, you could imagine a scenario where that could happen. I think there's a risk of that. They're probably not strong enough militarily to do it without paying a terrible price, because it would potentially draw in the United States and the United States allies into the conflict. So it could become pretty nasty for China, for everyone, but including for China.
It could make the fate of Taiwan a litmus test for which way this whole global contest of values might go between democratic states and more authoritarian ones. I ask a man called Puma Shen, who's an assistant professor at National Taipei University, whether he thinks grey zone tensions over his territory might erupt into armed conflict.
Living in Taiwan, do you feel on the front line of potentially something much, much more dangerous?
I mean, because people in Taiwan are kind of used to that. So that's why, like, even like every year that we got that kind of rumor, or maybe some of them are real news. People are kind of used to it, and it all happens always in April and October.
Why?
Because it's the best time to attack Taiwan.
The best time to attack? Oh, because of the weather?
Yeah. Because of the weather, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So we're kind of used to it. Like every April, every October, we're going to receive this kind of information. So people are kind of used to that. Yeah.
What do you think? Do you think that Taiwan can resist and can defend its democracy? Or do you think that eventually China will succeed and will bring Taiwan fully back within the Chinese system?
Yeah, I think with the effort of civil society, I think we could defend our democracy.
It shouldn't be a surprise, though, that an increasingly confident China might seek to challenge or gain more influence over a framework of global rules and institutions developed following the end of the Second World War that covers areas like universal human rights. Beijing will surely be aware that what is known as the rules-based international system is designed to bolster democratic governments and weaken authoritarian ones.
That's what that system was meant to do, was meant to advantage those systems and disadvantage authoritarians and isolate them, right? With the hopes that they would eventually see the light and kind of grant those kinds of rights to their citizens.
Matt Turpin from the Hoover Institution, perhaps counterintuitively from a Western perspective, draws an analogy with a moment in the 1997 spy comedy Austin Powers, when arch-villain Dr. Evil is in group counselling with his son Scott. He says to think of Dr. Evil as the West, and Scott as the Chinese Communist Party. The late Carrie Fisher, of course, is the therapist.
And Scott, the son, is asked, so what bothers you? And he says something to the effect of, I think my father's trying to kill me. And, Carrie Fisher's character, laughs. No one's trying to, we may say they're trying to kill us, but no one's trying to kill you. And then Dr. Evil's character sort of steps in and says, no, the boy is actually quite right. I am trying to kill him. I mean, this is what we're trying to do, is undermine authoritarian regimes. I mean, it is not something that we want to see go on. Now, we don't want war. We'd love to see them transition from, whether it's what we saw in South Korea, moving away from an authoritarian sort of military rule to a fully functioning democracy, and then the explosion of prosperity that happened after that, or the same thing in Taiwan, in which we moved away from an authoritarian regime into something that looked very much like, a fully functioning model democracy, and which has then had enormous prosperity for its citizens, right? And so that idea is sort of, I think, at the fundamental level of what we'd want to see. And so I think it creates this dilemma for the PRC, in which to continue to have a system that sort of respects individual rights threatens their existence. And that sets us up for rivalry and competition that is likely to continue. And the sooner we kind of understand those dynamics, probably the better off we will be to make other decisions.
It's a contest that's playing out right now in the grey zone, regardless of whether or not leaders on either side want to admit it. And it has the potential to affect everyone. While tensions between China and the United States are very much still contained, and neither side wants to see an escalation, what does happen when the grey zone becomes a war zone?
If the UK was subjected to about 2 weeks of missile attacks removing power, water, telecoms, cyber attacks that amplify that and add new harm, and social media messaging telling them that this is only going to get worse, then we would quickly find that our will to resist was depleted. And if you did that, not a single enemy boot or plane or ship has come into your territory.
But that's next time, as we continue into the grey zone. Into the Grey Zone is a Sky News podcast. It was edited and produced by Chris Scott, with production support from Sophia McBride and Michael Greenfield, and in Taiwan, Mei Chin Lin, and narrated by me, Deborah Haynes. The head of Sky News Radio is Dave Terrace. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.